space, the final frontier. These are the adventures of a fat bearded nerd on YouTube. His mission? To read science fiction novels based on a beloved TV series he's never seen. To discover new forms of fiction that actually aren't that new at all. And to boldly go where many men have gone before. Hello there, fellow travelers. It's Tim from Secret Flyer Books here with the first episode of a series that I plan on doing at least once a month here on the channel, where I, having never watched a single episode of Star Trek in my life, read and review Star Trek novels for the channel. And I should preface this by saying that I do know just a little bit about Star Trek through the sort of cultural osmosis. I know a few characters and plot points. I know about most of the main cast, I think. There's Captain James T. Kirk, who's played by William Shatner, and he's sort of the stereotypical heroic leader of the group. He's kind of a womanizer as well. I know Leonard Nimoy's character, Mr. Spock, who's the chief science officer, and he's very logically minded. He's a Vulcan, or rather, he's half Vulcan, as I learned in this book that I read. There is, there's Dr. Bones McCoy, who's famous for saying, "He's dead, Jim." There's Scotty, who's an engineer. There is Lieutenant Uhura, who, there was a famous episode where I think she and Captain Kirk shared a kiss, and that was controversial at the time because it was the 60s, and that was the first ever interracial kiss that was broadcast on national television, which is kind of crazy. I know there's an episode where Kirk fights this lizard alien called a Gorn, and people make fun of it all the time because it's this really slow, awkward-looking fight scene. I know about phasers and beaming people down and beaming people up. And I know that apparently if you're an actor who goes down with the main cast on the planet's surface and you're wearing a red shirt, that means your character is going to die, because apparently that's what they did with all the extraneous characters in that show, and it's where we get the term red shirt in popular culture. But the first book that I read for this series was Star Trek Shadow Lord by Laurence with this awesome Boris Vallejo cover on the front. And this one really kind of spoke to me, which is why I bought it when I went out to the thrift store and checked out some Star Trek novels. But I ran a poll, and out of the two Star Trek novels I bought, people wanted me to read this one the most. So I went ahead and did that, and it was quite a bit of fun. Even though I've never watched Star Trek before, I had actually a lot of fun with the Shadow Lord novel. So guess we'll get into it. The story begins with the crew of the Enterprise escorting Prince Vikram of Angira back to his home planet. Now, Angira is this relatively primitive world that has only just recently been introduced to Starfleet and by extension the Federation of Planets. Vikram, who is one of many children of the Emperor of Angira, has been spending the past several years of his life studying abroad on various planets across the Federation, learning as much as he can of politics and culture so that when he returns to his home world, he can help his people modernize and integrate with the rest of the Federation. There's actually a lot of very purposeful parallels between Angira modernizing with the Federation and Japan modernizing with the rest of the world during the mid to late 1800s. I thought that was very interesting. As the Enterprise approaches planet Angira, Captain Kirk realizes that he needs to send some of his representatives down with the prince to help ingratiate them with the Angirans. And the first officer he decides to send with him is Lieutenant Sulu, who's a character that I actually did not know about until reading this book. This was apparently George Takei's character from the original series. I knew George Takei was involved with Star Trek, I just didn't know what role he played. But yeah, Sulu is his character, and Vikram and Sulu have bonded over the past several days over their shared interest in fencing and historical weaponry. And so he's a no-brainer for an escort with the prince. And the other officer they decide to send down is Mr. Spock. And at first, Kirk is a little iffy about this because, as Bones McCoy very wisely warns him, the Angirans are a very traditional, very religious people, and all of their culture and all of their customs aren't necessarily logical, and Spock's very logical, blunt mindset might ruffle some feathers down there, or ruffle some fur, rather, because even though he's depicted as a sort of human-looking character on the front cover, Prince Vikram, and by extension the rest of the Angirans, are apparently these very tall, very fuzzy, kind of apish, animalistic humanoids. And I guess Boris Vallejo just didn't want to paint a furry on the front cover, which is understandable. However, the Angirans have requested that Starfleet send down a science officer of theirs to help them reorganize their star charts, which are very badly out of date. And no one knows star charts like Mr. Spock. So, going against Bones' wishes, Kirk decides to send Spock along with the Prince. And actually, he and the Prince have actually bonded pretty strongly as well over their shared interest in politics and philosophy. So, the only two officers that the Prince has really hit it off with are accompanying him down to the planet. But no sooner do they reach Vikram's people than they are immediately attacked by assassins, because apparently there is a very restless group of Angirans on the planet who are against modernism and see the Prince, and by extension, the entire royal family, as traitors to their race. And so they're going to try to kill the Prince and the rest of his family. And so not only do Sulu and Spock have to help protect the Prince from assassins and help de-escalate this crazy situation that's going on in Angira, they also have to survive on the planet for several weeks while the Enterprise is away on another mission and will come pick them up eventually. And so thus, the harrowing adventure of the Shadow Lord begins. I feel like what little prior knowledge I did already have about Star Trek and its characters definitely did help me with this book, because Laurence Yep does not beat around the bush. He just takes off with the plot. He immediately gets into the action. He doesn't take any time to introduce any of the characters or explain any of these concepts. He figured, if you're reading this book, you're a Star Trek fan, you know what Star Trek is about, you don't need any explanations. And I feel like if I didn't know what little I did about Star Trek due to that cultural osmosis, I'd kind of be floundering with the story here. But there is a pretty decent prologue that explains what Starfleet is doing, how they plan on returning Vikram to his people, and how they plan on integrating planet Angira with the Federation. But after that, we just take off at 100 miles per hour. By the end of Chapter 1, there are assassins all over the place. They're trying to kill Vikram. Spock and Sulu have to defend him from these assassins. They have to get him to safety, and they have to learn how to survive on this planet that basically wants them dead. And it ends up becoming, weirdly enough, this kind of sword and planet adventure story that is actually heavily, heavily inspired by feudal Japanese history. And as I learned in the afterword of this book, was also inspired by the Akira Kurosawa film Sanjuro, which I have not seen. I've seen a bunch of Akira Kurosawa's movies. I've seen Hidden Fortress, Yojimbo, Seven Samurai, which is one of my favorite movies of all time. I've not seen Sanjuro. I need to see it. I will at some point. But yeah, it's a very cool story that takes a lot of cues from samurai cinema and samurai fiction. And a lot of these sword fights are really, really cool. But the way they're described, I didn't get samurai movies so much as I got anime. I don't know, that was just my impression of it, but yeah, there is quite a lot going for this book. There's action and adventure, there's monsters and cool alien cultures, there's a literal dungeon crawl at one point, which is partially illustrated on the front cover here. Yeah, a lot of elements that I already enjoy in science fiction and fantasy that were blended together for this Star Trek novel, and I think this might have been the perfect way to introduce myself to the Star Trek universe, so I'm very glad I picked it up. It's actually pretty dark in some scenes as well. One scene in particular really stuck with me. The characters are traveling across this valley, searching for this village, and they come across a cemetery. And Sulu notices something interesting about this cemetery. And what are the jars? Sulu pointed to the hundreds of jars scattered all about the cemetery. They were colored brown and were about a third of a meter high. Their tops were sealed with bright orange clay. Are they offerings? In a manner of speaking, yes. Ermi's voice was edged with irony. They are infants, brought here to die because their families are too poor to feed them. She swung around to face them. There are hardly any children under the age of 5 in the valley.
You make me sad.
As for the actual Star Trek elements of this book, something that really surprised me is how much I actually enjoyed the character of Mr. Spock. Now, from what little I knew about him from popular culture, I always assumed that I'd never like Spock. He always came off as this sort of boring, overly serious character to me, and I was never interested in learning more about him. but the way he's portrayed in The Shadow Lord is actually very interesting. And I knew he was a Vulcan, one of the many alien races in the Star Trek universe. But what I didn't know until reading this book is that he's actually only half Vulcan and he's half human. And something that I quickly learned about the character is that he's a very conflicted person. The overly serious and stoic Vulcan half of his personality is constantly in conflict with the more emotional and aspirational human half of his personality. And I thought that made for a very interesting character dynamic, and I think Laurence did a really good job of describing it in the story. Whenever the characters have to make a choice about what to do next, I was always interested in hearing what Mr. Spock had to say. I was interested in hearing his take on the situation. Whenever the characters were separated, I was always interested in seeing what Mr. Spock was doing, even while we were following the other characters. And so I think it was a very good introduction to the character for me, all things considered. And I can see now that I was very wrong about him from the beginning. I can definitely see now why there are generations and generations of Star Trek fans who love this character. I think he's very cool. I have yet really to get to know the other two main protagonists of the original Star Trek series, Bones McCoy and Captain Kirk. They show up at the beginning of the book and a little later toward the end of the book, but I haven't really got to know them yet. I'm sure I will in future books. But yeah, as for now, I like Mr. Spock. He's cool with me. He's probably my favorite character so far. While I did enjoy this novel, I don't think it's anything fantastic. I think my major problem with it is that it feels very padded. This book is almost 300 pages long, but I don't think it needed to be that way. There's not nearly enough character development or plot going on in this book to necessitate that page count. There are a lot of very lengthy scenes of very expository dialogue, sometimes between characters who aren't really all that important to the story. Sometimes there are scenes where it feels like Laurence is channeling his inner J.R.R. Tolkien and is trying to go into detail and describe the surrounding area or the environment or the landscape. And unlike the world of Middle-earth, the world of Angira is not all that interesting, so it doesn't really work that well. And there's even this big battle scene near the end of the book, a big battle between these two armies that just drags on for a little too long, and it kind of overstays its welcome. You know I love action sequences, but that one kind of overstayed its welcome. I feel like this book is a 200-page novel that got bloated and expanded to 280 pages. And I don't think that needed to be the case. I think it could have been edited once or twice more. Then there's something else that kind of confused me. There is a moment later in the story where Sulu apparently goes against the Prime Directive. And I didn't know exactly what the Prime Directive was. I'd heard about it before, but I didn't know exactly what it was. I had to look it up afterward. And apparently it is a set of guidelines that instructs members of Starfleet what to do when they are confronted with a culture or a planet that is not yet part of the Federation of Planets. How basically not to ruin the culture or influence a race's cultural development in some way. And by his own admission, Sulu does something near the end of the book that goes against the Prime Directive, and he's fully ready to be court-martialed when he meets up with Captain Kirk again at the end of the book. But when the end finally comes around, Kirk and Spock explain to him in a kind of confusing way how he didn't violate the Prime Directive, or maybe it was okay that he violated the Prime Directive. I don't know. I don't know what they were saying exactly. And I thought to myself, is this a Conan the Avenger kind of situation where because I'm not a hardcore Star Trek fan, I don't really see a problem with it, but if I was a hardcore Star Trek fan, I would call this canon breaking? But I just don't know. I don't have any kind of set precedent for that. So if you're a big Star Trek fan and you've read The Shadow Lord, please let me know, is what Sulu did totally against the Prime Directive? And if so, does that break canon? Does that go against the source material? I don't know for sure. All in all, I think that Shadow Lord was a very solid introduction to the world of Star Trek for me. I'm excited to read more of the books. I actually ordered a bunch of the old James Blish novelizations off of eBay. They should be arriving in the mail any day now. But the next book in the series I'll be reading is Star Trek: The Abode of Life by Lee Corey, which features a little more of Captain Kirk, so I'm excited to read more about that character. But that's all for now, guys. Let me know in the comments, have you read Star Trek Shadow Lord? What did you think of it? Who is your favorite Star Trek character? And until next time, guys, as always, farewell, keep reading, and live long and prosper.
anything from the landing party?
They should be sending up a report momentarily, Captain.
Oh.
Something wrong?
A kink in my back. That's it. No, little higher, please. Push hard. Dig it in there, Mr. Thank you, Yeoman. That's sufficient.